This is Dr. Lisa Marie Bobby, and you're listening to the Love, Happiness, and Success podcast. Today, we're talking about why relationships fail and what you can do to protect yours.
We're setting sail to the place on the map from which no one.
That is a somewhat sinister version of the song Ship of Fools, originally written and performed by World Party. This time we're hearing Nocturne Blues version of it. Interesting band with lots of good stuff. You can learn more about Nocturne Blue on their Bandcamp page, nocturneblue.bandcamp.com. Good stuff. And oh, so appropriate for our topic today, my friends, especially this part. With that warning in mind, let's dive in. On today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about a topic that is very challenging, one that people don't like to think about, but one that is vitally important for you to know about and to be thinking about really deliberately. And that is why marriages fail, why relationships end. Personally, I'm a marriage counselor. I'm a psychologist. I have sat with so many couples, and many of whom very eager and motivated to repair their marriages, repair their relationships. We do great work. And over the years, I have sat with many couples whose relationships were ending. And I can tell you that every single one of them went into their relationships with the best of intentions. On their wedding day, they meant everything they said about sharing the rest of their lives together till death do us part. And they meant it. But then their relationships eroded slowly. Over time, it fell apart. They kept falling apart. And by the time they got to my office, they were past the point of no return. There wasn't the fabric left to kind of knit things back together again. And the tragedy of virtually all of these situations, and I have felt this many times sitting on the couch in my therapy office with these couples, is if only you had seen what was happening and intervened a little bit sooner. The truth is that so many couples have opportunities to mend their relationships, but they miss the opportunities because in the moment, they often don't realize how serious things are before it's too late. And the truth is that there are small micro moments that happen in relationships that are much more damaging than people think they are. And by understanding this, really truly appreciating it, you become empowered to make changes sooner rather than later so that your marriage endures. And so understanding what failing relationships actually look like and actually feel like is what can help you identify these moments, the ones that you need to take seriously and not minimize them, because that's such a natural tendency to do. And so with me today to take a deep dive into what you really need to be noticing and paying attention to differently is the author Matthew Frey. His new book is called This Is How Your Marriage Ends: A Hopeful Approach to Saving Relationships. Matthew learned these lessons the hard way and is here with me today to share his hard-earned insight with you for your benefit. So, Matthew, thank you so much for being with me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I really appreciate the invitation.
Good. Well, thank you again so much. And I have to I think I mentioned it to you, but I'll share with my audience. So I read all the time. When I'm not, working, basically, I have my nose either in a book or an article about something. And so it was just a couple of weeks ago, I was browsing around online and I came across an article that you had written, Matt, for The Atlantic, an excerpt from your book. And I just remember reading your words. And first of all, just being struck by what a beautiful writer you are. I was reading it, I was like, wow, I wish I could write this well. But also like the message that you conveyed in this article was just like dead on. It was like, this is what I've been trying to tell people for years and years. And if it's okay with you, I thought maybe we could start with just this little excerpt from what you wrote to kind of orient our listeners to your message, and then we can go from there. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So the title of the article was The Marriage Lesson That I Learned Too Late, with the very intriguing subheading of you said, the reason my marriage fell apart seems absurd when I describe it. My wife left me because I sometimes leave dishes by the sink. Very intriguing, right? But when you go into the article, I mean, you just so beautifully described, I think, this phenomenon that's so real and true for so many couples. You write, the things that destroy love and marriage often disguise themselves as unimportant. Many dangerous things neither appear nor feel dangerous as they're happening. They're not bombs and gunshots. They're pinpricks. They're paper cuts. And that is the danger. When we don't recognize something as threatening, then we're not on guard. These tiny wounds start to bleed, and the bleed out is so gradual that many of us don't recognize the threat until it's too late to stop it. You go on to say, I spent most of my life believing that what ended marriages were behaviors I classify as major marriage crimes. If murder, rape, and armed robbery are major crimes in the criminal justice system, I viewed sexual affairs, physical spousal abuse, and gambling away the family savings as the major crimes in a marriage. And because I wasn't committing major marriage crimes, when my wife and I were on the opposite sides of an issue, I would suggest that we agree to disagree. I believed that she was wrong, either that she was fundamentally incorrect in her understanding of the situation or that she was treating me unfairly. It always seemed as if the punishment didn't fit the crime, as if she were charging me with premeditated murder when my infraction was something closer to driving a little bit over the speed limit with a burned out taillight that I didn't even know was burned out. Hundreds, maybe thousands of times, my wife tried to communicate that something was wrong, that something hurt. But that didn't make sense, I thought. I'm not trying to hurt her. Therefore, she shouldn't feel hurt. We didn't go down in a fiery explosion. We bled out from 10,000 paper cuts, quietly, slowly. She knew something was wrong. I insisted everything was fine. This is how my marriage ended. It could be how yours ends too. Whoa, what powerful words, Matthew. I mean, I read that and I was like, yeah, that's exactly what happens. And most people have no idea that it's even happening when it's happening.
Oh, I was really flattered. Nothing has propelled book sales since launch. The book's been out 6 or 7 weeks now. March 22 in North America was book launch. Nothing had as significant of an impact on those sales as that Atlantic excerpt did. So I was extremely grateful for it. And as a former journalist, being in a publication that I respect as much as the Atlantic was, like, just personally, like, a really cool opportunity to have a byline in it.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, as you said, it was an excerpt from the book. It was really more their work than mine, to be fair. They took the lion's share of that excerpt from a section of the book, which is based on a blog post that I wrote in 2016 called She Divorced Me Because I Left Dishes by the Sink. And that was far and away the most popular thing that I've ever written. If anybody has ever heard of me or anything like that, it would be almost certainly because of that article. Millions and millions of times that thing's been read and shared. And nothing else in my world had that level of reach. And I've just come to understand that it's a popular conversation for people to have. Although I fear a great majority of the people miss the point of the conversation, because I get the lion's share of the criticism I receive as either a blogger or now as author of the book, This Is How Your Marriage Ends, is The idea that a dish by the sink it's the same argument I made, right, in my actual marriage. The argument that is such an insignificant thing and our marriage is so important. And the idea that I love you is so important. So let's not elevate this dish by the sink to a marriage problem. And that's more or less the arguments that I'm getting from predominantly men in heterosexual relationships with women who I assume say things similar to the things my wife said in regards to the way the dish by the sink caused her to feel, like her experience with that dish, her thoughts and feelings about it. And they make the case that their desire to leave it there, that's well thought out, and that their individual experiences should weigh equally. And I'm very interested in your take on this idea. And I'm fine with people thinking that, right? I'm fine. The way that I think about it is that putting a dish in the dishwasher and having to take it out again, or having to get a new one from the cupboard, or finding some new system that it was a glass, by the way. I think people imagine, especially because the Atlantic had the sink full of like all these dirty dishes. That's not what it was. It was, and I still keep it there. It's a clear drinking glass, one glass that I put water in once a day to like take vitamins and medicine and things like that. It just bothered her because she liked like the kitchen, a certain standard and clean. And people take great exception to the idea that my opinion, men, I think, who identify with me of 10 or 15 years ago, feel like we need to defend our position that our desires, our wants, our quote unquote needs should matter as much as our spouses. And I think they should. I think they should matter the same, but I don't think we're having the same conversation. I don't feel dishonored, disrespected, not considered, small, invisible because of my wife's desire to have me put the dish in the dishwasher. And the alternative is not true. Me leaving it there does, in fact, result in pain and feelings of disrespect and feelings of being unheard. And so instead of having a conversation about the merits of that dish being there, I want to have a conversation about the merits of behaving in such a way, speaking and acting in such a way, where the math result is showing up effectively for our relationship partners. You may very well be married to somebody who does not care about that dish by the sink. They may share your lack of enthusiasm for that, but there will be a different conversation about something, because we're human beings, that will matter to them, that will not like resonate intellectually or emotionally with you. You will simply not care the same. I don't know how to say it sort of like more precisely than that. You won't care as much. And it's that disagreement that I think is at like the epicenter of like the common conflict pattern in relationships. And I just think for the person who feels unheard, who feels as if I can never go to my relationship partner and communicate something's wrong, because it seems as if they don't agree with me, they will always choose what they think and what they feel over me for the rest of my life. It means I have to like deal with that and accept it and voluntarily, subject myself to that, or I have to leave. We leave. In my case, I left my wife with an exceedingly difficult choice, which was keep her son 100% of her life, like have him at home and have to deal with that, or leave and give herself a chance for, a relationship or not having, regardless, whether she was going to be single or whether she was going to see somebody else, not being subjected to the approval of someone to feel a certain way about something, because that's essentially what that story is about. I didn't give her permission to hurt. I didn't give her permission to think that dish by the sink mattered. And go ahead and insert any example from your personal life, dear listener, because it's not always a dish, but metaphorically it is. It's everybody has their own dish by the sink story in their relationship. And, everybody, I think, most people I encounter are savvy enough to recognize it. I talked to somebody a day or two ago where it's like he wore shoes in the house all the time. And his wife just repeatedly would ask him not to. And most of the time, if he was like coming home for the day, he'd take them off. But what if he like went outside really quick to like go to the garage for something? And then it's like, oh, I forgot something in the house. I'm going to sprint over to the bedroom, but I'm not going to take the time to take my shoes off. Like those were the moments that like drove her she got really upset with them. And again, it's not about the relative impact of like wearing shoes in the house. It is, I will always choose me over you whenever we disagree. that destroys trust in relationships.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we can crack into that further, but I love that message of really being able to think about your behaviors, our behaviors in the context of what they mean to other people, because it's different for other people than it is for us. And that in some ways can be the definition of love, right? Our partner's needs and rights and feelings are just as important as our own. And how do we show them that? Yeah.
I think it's reasonable for people to not want to accept responsibility for that. And it shows up, I think, particularly in like sociopolitical conversations and religious differences. It's the idea that what I believe is right and true, and if that offends another person, it's really their problem. And that mindset, I think, is fine. I don't adopt it. It's how I used to be. It is exactly the mindset I used to have that I think resulted in the worst thing that's ever happened to me, which was the end of my marriage and family. So that's why I'm not in favor of showing up in the world that way anymore. But I don't begrudge people doing that. I don't think it's immoral. I just think if we're not cognizant of what happens to another human when we do that, it's not about you being bad. It's not about that behavior being bad, in my estimation. Forgive me, I'm not trying to speak for you or anyone else. But for me, the thing to value is the math result. The math result of showing up that way in our interpersonal relationships, or really probably with anybody, I believe means that we won't have as much trust. We will not be trusted as much with the hearts and minds of other human beings. People want to trust that being in our sphere, whether that's being close friends or professional colleagues or best friends or whatever, but certainly when we share homes and bedrooms and money and children, and our lives are super intertwined the way they are in marriage or long-term cohabitating relationships. And again, particularly when you're raising children together, the stakes get even higher. And when somebody can't trust you to what I would sort of like say is act in their best interest, on account that we don't think the dish qualifies, right? We know we'll walk with you in the parking garage and that we'll keep you safe from an intruder or whatever it is that people think about what it means to like show up lovingly and caring for someone else. It's this miscalculation that something that doesn't matter to you is somehow not able to matter to somebody else. That is such a significant blind spot, I think, in relationships. And I think I understand why it is, because I've sort of lived both sides of it now.
Yeah, it was about the glass on the side of the sink, but it also wasn't. You know, the glass just became a symbol for how your wife felt. It was a symbol for the relationship unraveling, because it wasn't about the glass. It was about what the glass meant. You know, it was interpreted as, do you care about my feelings? Am I important to you? And that's what we lose sight of when we get into power struggles about where the glass goes, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's reasonable for somebody who has successful relationships. This is something that I talk with a lot of. As you know, I work as like a relationship coach per se. And people come to me and, you know, guys they're like, wow, you sound exactly like me. And I'm like, I understand. And I try to help them understand that there's no judgment, and that in a certain respect, it really makes sense. When all of your family relationships are solid, when you have a bunch of friends, when you're successful at work, when you're liked and respected and appreciated, it's so frustrating when the only person in your life who like levies charges of like mistreatment is the person that you feel like you love the most and sacrifice the most for. It does not compute. And in sort of like math, data analysis terms, she's the outlier. She's the statistical outlier. And a data scientist eliminates the statistical outlier as the thing that's not like the rest. And I just think that is the like autopilot thing that so many people do. And again, often men in heterosexual relationships, it would seem, that just dismiss these concerns of the other person because they're so unlike any of the feedback that they're getting from any other part of their life. So I always want to defend these people. There are certainly people with ill intentions that cause a lot of harm. And I don't mean to overlook those or trivialize the struggles of being in a relationship with somebody who you feel sort of tricked you or conned you into a life together and then emerged as something really, really awful and, like tyrannical in either subtle or overt ways. But I think the majority, from a math standpoint, of these relationships are exactly as you described at the beginning, where two people voluntarily chose one another and absolutely are in this to go the distance, and then are fundamentally confused 5, 7, 10, 15 years later as to how it could have deteriorated and how it can feel so bad. Because all along the way, it just seemed like nothing rose to the level of being important. And I equate it to what the American Cancer Society had to do in the 1950s, the 1960s on their campaign to convince the public of the dangers of tobacco smoking. Because back then, the societal norm was to smoke in a car with the windows rolled up and babies in the back seat, with like no meaningful.
Everybody does it. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe not even in like some sort of like safe car seat, just riding on somebody's lap. And it's just, that was how things were. And we didn't know. And it's just like, if you don't know smoking is harmful, I think it makes sense to smoke. In fact, I used to do it in my youth, and I'm so glad that I don't. And people like make mindful changes once they understand that this thing equals harm. Not all people, but many people. And that is, to me, the mission is, can people understand that this thing they don't calculate to be harmful is in fact harmful? And I don't necessarily know how to do it except just keep doing what I'm trying to do. What so many people in this space are trying to do.
I mean, even just talking about this, you're exactly right. Is people literally do not understand that these small things are dangerous. It's the equivalent of smoking a cigarette. They have no idea. And so one of the things that I've been on such a mission about, like premarital counseling, we do a lot of like that preventative stuff, but also just talking about this so that people can just have that mirror. Because who talks about this? Like nobody teaches you how to have a healthy relationship, right? We just our own divorced parents were the role models, and it's like somebody has to be talking about this, and that's why I'm thrilled for this. And so to even crack deeper in this, like in your book, one of the first chapters that you write, and I think that this is such a nice idea too. Good people can make bad spouses, because we think about people who aren't good at relationships as being uncaring or unloving, and that is not true. Lovely people are unconsciously making these mistakes that they don't even know are mistakes in the moment. But can you say more about that idea? Good people can make bad spouses.
I can. It's one of my favorite things that I ever thought of, because one of my sort of like hallmark traits in my marriage was defensiveness, feeling unfairly criticized, unfairly attacked, as if my wife wasn't giving me the benefit of the doubt. Because it's like, goodness, I do all these things. It's like, why are you interpreting this in the most negative, cynical way possible? Is often sort of how I responded to whatever was like happening in her life, and just habitually invalidating and dismissive, which is awful when I'm claiming to like love, right? Again, please understand, I know you know.
Yeah.
But listener,
it happens together.
Yeah, I didn't associate how I just fundamentally thought I was being mistreated, truly, in that moment. Even though I really recognize today she was. But that's the danger, is I think two humans in a shared life together can very honestly believe that they're like sort of doing the right thing, that they're on the unfair receiving end of this. And
absolutely.
I want to sell people on the idea, particularly people prone to defensiveness in a relationship, from negative feedback from their relationship partner, that it doesn't have to be about good, bad. Doesn't even have to be about right, wrong. It is completely disassociated with character. It is good people can be bad partners. And I thought it was useful to think about. I described my grandmother as a person that I think is above reproach from a character standpoint. She's incredible, just the nicest human being. And just I've never, ever in my 43 years seen my grandmother speak ill of anyone or mistreat anyone. She'll like make excuses for like the worst people, actually. She's like that kind of lady and loves humans. But I make the case, despite my grandmother's impeccable character, I don't think that's who you'd want to like contract to build a skyscraper, to fly an airplane, or to fix your watch, or whatever. Anything that's difficult in life to do. Developing expertise and mastery of something is about knowledge and about skill building, about practice. So we learn things and then we practice doing things, trying to execute best practices over and over again. And that's how we develop skills, mastery, knowledge, things like that. And I did not know how to associate. I was so busy thinking because I was a decent human that I was automatically a decent husband, a decent spouse. And to me, that belief alone creates so many blind spots, so many ways of defending oneself and deflecting responsibilities and things like that. And if I'd thought of marriage and relationships as something that I needed to develop expertise and mastery about, and this is nobody's fault. This was my responsibility. But I do think we've raised generations of people without some of the building block knowledge and skills necessary to relate effectively. And again, I think the most important skill that I didn't understand, I say empathy, I think, and I don't necessarily mean to organically feel how others feel. When I say that, I mean this idea of like intentionally choosing to view a scenario through the experiences of someone else that you love, and then sort of modifying words and actions accordingly because you care about them. But more to the point, and I don't think I talked about this in the book because I don't think I had awareness about the relational cycle of harmony, disharmony, repair, is that capacity for repair, like in that moment, was a big, big miss for me in my marriage that I try really hard to encourage people to think about today.
Yeah. No, the repair is so important. But you bring up such another great point that I think cannot be understated, is also the power of systems. And so on this show, something that we talk about a lot is how relationships are a dance. I mean, people aren't just being individuals in the system, right? They're being influenced by each other. And it's very, very easy to perceive your partner as being out to get you or in the wrong, which then allows you to feel entitled to be not very kind to them in return, and that the relationship system can kind of take on a cycle of its own. But also even those repair attempts, while they are so important, if there's so much, John Gottman calls it negative affect priming, that if it gets to a certain point, repair attempts don't work anymore. So it's just so key to get into this sooner rather than later. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that to have had the humility, I think, to consider, like we all do, maybe I do have some learning and growing to do in order to be a good partner for this specific person, right? As opposed to that kind of global message around, I'm a good person, I can have relationships, I know what to do. So there's something wrong with her. that's like the easy default to assume. Yeah. I
may very well end up in a long-term romantic relationship with somebody that doesn't care about a dish by the sink, that doesn't care about certain like idiosyncrasies that my son's mother like may have had, or pain points that she'd felt. But there will be new things, there will be other things. And it is incumbent on me to learn those, to understand them, if I am to effectively like prevent negative experiences on her part, and vice versa. Again, I don't mean to sound like I don't think both partners, and if we're talking again, heterosexual relationships, men, I don't mean that their needs are also important. I just only know how to approach this from my side of it, the personal responsibility side of it. And I trust that it'll be reciprocated in a healthy relationship. Like, I don't see how being unhealthy will in any way yield a positive result. And another point of negative feedback is, Matt, surely your ex-wife was imperfect. Surely she did stuff you didn't like too. Don't you think maybe you're taking all the blame here? And I'm like, I don't like the word blame. I don't finger point. I'm like, I'm for personal responsibility. I'm like, even if I only did 20% of it, just maybe all of the things that I might not have liked that my ex-wife was, maybe how can I fairly calculate for what she would have said, done, felt had I eliminated my portion of like the pain that was being caused. And I really want people to think about that. It's so critical. It's not fair to hurt people and then be angry with them for behaving as a hurt person does, is my take today. Where that's exactly how I used to act though. I did things, it hurt my wife. She would say it hurt. And then I would be angry that she was creating a relationship conflict. And it was awful. And I really see it so clearly today in a way I didn't when I was stuck in it. And I hate it for her. I really do. And for everybody who's stuck in like that cycle.
Right. Well, you can't see in them. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've sat with couples and they're, waiting for the other person to change, waiting for the other person to take responsibility. Well, if they stop doing that, right? And to like help people wrap their heads around the idea that you actually have to take 100% of the responsibility for whatever happens in your relationship. Ideally, you'll both be taking 100% of the responsibility, but that's absolutely the only thing that you can do is keep your side of the equation clean. So, yeah. And I wonder if that was kind of what you were getting into in the next section of your book, where you talked about invalidation triple threat. Can you take us into that idea?
Yeah, and I'd be curious because I think I value your thoughts and opinions and experiences, frankly, more than mine in the context of the way couples relate to one another. But I make the claim in the book that I believe this invisible, it's certainly not invisible to the person who feels invalidated, but I think to the invalidator who genuinely loves the person and wants to live with them for the rest of their lives, I think this is the greatest blind spot, the greatest source of accidental, inadvertent trust erosion, and therefore the greatest threat to relationships, the leading cause of relationship failure. Since whenever speech started happening between romantic partners, I just perceive this to probably be the thing that's ended more relationships than anything else. And I don't mean marriage. There's a million relationships never get to marriage. There's so many that never get there. And I still think this is probably at the epicenter of so much of it. And so, yes, and the invalidation triple threat, as I call it, are the three distinct ways that I believe somebody with this habit that I had, and I find it's very common in the people that like find me and want to work with me. We don't intend to invalidate. And as I recently learned from somebody in your line of work from Australia, she said, intention does not equal experience. And right, that's a more efficient way of saying what I try to say is that it doesn't matter what you're trying to do. Pain can still happen on the other side of the equal sign. It disguises itself as harmless disagreement. It disguises itself as a disagreement between two adults, and it's reasonable for a human being to feel as if they're allowed to have a difference of opinion, a different experience, a different desire than the other person. And I was so offended that it seemed like my wife needed me to agree with her all the time. But that's not what validation is. It's not about agreeing. It's not about thinking the same things my wife felt. It's not about feeling the same things my wife felt. Here's what it looked like in my life. She would come to me and she would say, Matt, a bad thing happened and I feel bad about it. And version one of this triple threat is I would disagree with her intellectual experience. The thing that she believed had happened, I would have believed something else happened. So I'd reframe it. I'd say, that's actually not what happened. What happened is this. But the math result of that exchange is your feelings don't matter because it's based on something that wasn't real. That's version one. Version two is my wife comes to me and she says, Matt, a bad thing happened. I feel bad about it. And this time I completely agree with her that the event happened exactly as she says it did. But this time I'm confused as to why she's reacting so sensitively or angrily or whatever it is. And I'm like, okay, that's what happened, but why are you making such a big deal out of it? So in version one, her brain's wrong. I don't say this, but the implication is that she's dumb, that she's wrong, that she's crazy. Version two, I don't say this, but the implication is that she's weak, that she's hypersensitive, that she's being dramatic, something like that. Version three is just classic defensiveness, which is why I think that character conversation, that good people can be bad spouses idea is so important. You can be an amazing human and still not be awesome at some function. So think about it like that when somebody's coming at you, maybe with some negative feedback or criticism. My wife would say, Matt, you did something, it hurt me. And my instinct was to like defend myself, to say, wait a minute, I did not mean to hurt you. If you understand like what I was trying to do, you won't be mad at me anymore. You won't feel bad anymore or something. Anyway, all of these response patterns are inherently invalidating to the person who's trying to communicate something's wrong, something hurts me, and I'm trying to let you know because you're not psychic, and I'm trying to recruit you to understand it so that tomorrow and next week and next month and next year, the same thing won't keep happening. That's the goal of the conversation, where person who's hurt comes to the other partner and just wants to let them know, hey, something's wrong, help me. But if my brain did not align with my wife's brain, I didn't respond in a manner that suggested tomorrow I wouldn't do the same thing over again. If my feelings didn't align, if my intentions didn't align, here's what my wife learned. She learned after 12 years with me that if I didn't agree with what she believed, or I didn't agree that she should feel the way that she felt, that I would always choose what I thought and what I felt over her, even at the expense of her emotional experiences. That's what she learned. And so if we want to talk about trust in a relationship, and trust, in my estimation, being the most significant condition required for relationship health and longevity, and I just think a lot of people think love is, and I think a lot of people painfully leave a relationship with somebody they love. And I just think the absence of trust, the erosion of trust, is the greatest predictor of relationships that will end. And we can do this as a decent human who loves his or her relationship partner, but just fails to validate over and over and over and over again. Because the message is simply, I'll always choose me over you. Even though, that's not philosophically how I thought about it. It's the math result of the conversation pattern. And we have to take ownership of that and learn how to eliminate what I've come to believe is this very unhealthy, toxic conversational dance that we do in our relationships. I coach people to begin a new habit of validating, replacing the habit of invalidation with validating. And I like talking about it as habits because I'm not smart enough and I'm not good enough as a human being to help somebody make some spiritual change, so to speak, or to, grow intensely. I do know how to encourage somebody to change a small behavior and practice it over and over and over again, in the hopes that the math result will be trust restoration in a relationship.
Definitely. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it is ultimately all about that behavior change. And I think what you just shared is so important in understanding, helping people understand the why it's so significant, because I am certain that if I had been in the room with you and that was happening and be like, what's going on? You loved your wife. You had nothing but good intentions. You're probably trying to help her in that moment. If we had to crack into your point of view, it wasn't
certainly sometimes
ill-intentioned, but that result of really understanding the way that people feel. And I think also understanding what the priority is in those conversations is that emotional intimacy. It's attunement. It's feeling cared about. And that's how adults express that and receive that, is often through sharing feelings and feeling important and emotionally safe with others when they do. And to be able to learn how to do that is just such a crucial relationship skill. And unfortunately, and not to gender stereotype, but you've mentioned several times in our conversation so far that can often be men in heterosexual relationships who struggle here. And I firmly believe that this is largely due to just a lack of socialization, that these kinds of skills aren't prioritized in boys and young men as they're growing up. And so they literally don't know how, don't know it's a thing, don't know why it's important. Why would I do that anyway? Until they experience the consequences of it and start having these conversations.
Dr. Bobby, do we have time to talk about this funny little monster under the bed analogy that I like to share?
I'd love to hear about the monster.
Do we?
in the bed.
Well, it's the thing that helped me. And so I went from like guy, just like all these other guys. And I now like try to help people not practice this invalidation habit anymore. And this is the thought exercise that like broke through for me. And I honestly don't remember how I even thought of it. It's just the thing I eventually concocted that worked. My son is 13, but he used to be 4. And when he was 4, he was a threat to wake up in the middle of the night, afraid of a monster hiding under his bed. And I like to think about how I would have shown up in that scenario 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And the way is, let's pretend I'm watching Monday Night Football and I hear my son crying. So I'm going to, pause it or just run upstairs or whatever. And I'm going to open the door and I'm going to discover that my son is crying and feeling fear because he thinks there might be a monster under his bed. And my default instinct back then, as his father, would be, I know there's no monster. I don't want my son to feel afraid. I want him to stop crying, selfishly, because I want to go watch football again. And the way I'm going to solve this problem is to sell him on this knowledge that I have that he doesn't have, that there isn't a monster under the bed. And so I might say something really careless and not very good from a parenting standpoint, in my estimation, but many of us maybe grew up like this, that says, dude, there's no monster under the bed. There's no reason to be crying right now. You're afraid for no reason. Settle down. Everything's fine. I might say something super toxic, like, be my big boy, toughen up. Everything's okay. This has been your bedroom your whole life. Like, go to sleep. And, I'll see you in the morning. I don't have time for invisible monsters. That might be some like gross, selfish thing that I might have done, 10, 12 years ago. Anyway, I just think there's like really critical ideas to think about for like the guy that's me in this scenario that didn't grow up with relational skills, because I understand why we know the threat isn't there. And if we can just like implant that knowledge in this other human, then problem solved and we get to go back to doing whatever we were doing before. I think that's like the way we're thinking about it. And I think there's like, if there was a judge in the room, I'm right. In this instance, right? Not all relationship conflict is so demonstrably provable. A lot of times it's more nuanced than that. But in this case, I'm right. And I love my son, and I would never, ever try to hurt him. Despite those 3 things, what's the math result of this example? My son's alone in the dark. He's afraid. He's crying. And he just learned that if dad doesn't think the thing that's adversely affecting me is important, if he doesn't think my sadness or my fear is worthy of his time, he abandons me, literally or metaphorically, to cry alone in the dark after implying that I'm stupid or weak for acting the way that I'm acting right now. And it doesn't mean this child in this example doesn't know dad loves him. I think it just means trust eroded. I think it means the quality score of our relationship just took a hit. And that if that's how I always show up when he's suffering through things large or small, over time, I'm going to lose all of the trust that I just earned that I was just gifted as his father. And in the future, when he hurts, he's not going to invite dad to be part of those conversations. So, right, when he's offered drugs, when he's experiencing bullying, when he's whatever, some really unpleasant things in his life that I, as his father, really want to be included in order to like be like a decent, connected, loving father, he won't invite me to. I'm no longer a safe person to include when like life's hard. And so I really like the guys that I'm working with to think about that. And hopefully they get that this is like a metaphor, our adult relationships and the way that we respond to people when we think that they believe something that isn't real, or when we're somehow like disagreeing with their emotional reaction to something, because there's a better way. Because it's not about agreeing with your relationship partner. It's not about agreeing that there's a monster under the bed. That's not the thing that makes your relationship better. And in fact, being right, I think in this instance, proves to harm the relationship, increases disconnection, increases mistrust. And there's another way to show up, and it's who I want to be today. And I hear my son crying, I'm going to run up, I'm going to open the door, I'm going to sit on the bed, I'm going to hug the kid. I'm going to find out what's going on. And I'm going to say, dude, I don't think there's a monster under the bed, but I'm really sorry that you're afraid right now. I have been afraid, and it's just about the worst experience one can have. And I'm so sorry. Let's turn a light on to make sure there's no monster under the bed. And the idea that I really want the guys I'm working with to like embrace and latch onto for dear life is the following. and this is me talking to my hypothetical son in this example, is when life's hard, when things hurt, when things scare you, I want you to know you can always call mom, you can always call dad, and we're going to show up for you. And even if we can't fight your battle for you or fix what's wrong, you never have to feel alone. You never have to feel like you're the only person suffering this bad thing that you're experiencing. That's what you can trust to happen over and over again when you call dad, when you call mom. And that is the lesson that I really want the guys that feel like I did 10, 15 years ago to walk away from this conversation with, to like set aside feelings of correctness, feelings of certainty, feelings of I got to fight for what's right because I know that I know more about this than she or he or they do. Value the quality of your relationship. And the way it's done is by communicating that in the future, when bad things happen to them, you might not be able to fix what's wrong. You can just try to understand, you can care, but most importantly, you're not going to neglect and abandon the people you love to suffer alone. And I think that really nuanced behavior change, mindset change, and Brené taught me, right? Like that idea. Brené Brown's work taught me about like the metaphorical idea of sitting with your friend in the dark so that they didn't feel alone, because I was always like, who just sits still and doesn't do anything? You feel so helpless. But it's not about that. It's not about it at all. It's about communicating that today and tomorrow and always, if you're suffering, I know that I can't fix it. It's not about that. You're just not alone. I'll give you space if you need it, but if you want to not be alone, you'll never have to be. I wish I'd given that to the people that I loved my entire life, but nobody had imparted on me like the wisdom of like, right, that behavior, that messaging. And so the only person who's ever really truly gotten it's my son, because it's a thing that I've learned, and he's about ready to go to high school, and I think he is going to trust me. Yeah.
Well, now you can teach him differently, but I totally agree. Like it's not we don't attribute a lot of value to just simple connection, right? I think we're socialized into doing or fixing or problem solving, and it's really just being there together in those moments that's the most important thing. But it's so easy to miss. And hey, can I ask? I don't know if this would be too personal of a question, and if it is, we can scoot over. But I'm thinking right now of people, couples, individuals who might be listening to this show, and in my experience, it is so easy for people to talk themselves out of doing something, getting help for their relationship. It's not that big of a deal. It'll be okay. It's just we've been stressed, but looking back at your own experience, if you had a time machine, can you identify some of those fork in the road moments that if you had done something or taken action at that time, it could have led to a different outcome? Like, I'm wondering what your advice would be for somebody who's maybe for whom that fork in the road is still a little ways ahead of them, just to help them see it more clearly than you were able to.
Yeah, I can think of several of them, but the problem is they present small, and so I feel they'll seem so undramatic to everybody. But a quick list would be, and I mentioned in the book, and this is one of the things I'm most ashamed of in the world, is a couple of these that I mentioned in the book. That some of them that I'm most ashamed of in the world. At the very beginning of our dating relationship, early, I was still like really interested in like autonomy and not feeling like trapped in a relationship because we'd only been dating, I don't know, a couple of months or something. And I would like make plans to like go see friends and things like that. And then I'd get some negative feedback about that. I don't know if you remember this, but she gave up. She was going to move with 3 of her friends to a different state. And she completely changed her life plans to remain in the city just so she could pursue a relationship with me. And then what she got in return was me continuing to fight to be like the single quasi-bachelor guy. And I don't literally mean that. I don't mean like so I could go date other people. But I mean, at 21, I had no desire or context for this idea of inclusion, of consideration, of thinking about, if I make plans on a Thursday or a Friday or a Saturday to go to this bar or keg party or whatever I'm doing, I should absolutely be checking in with my person to see how it might affect her. It was just not an idea that had fully cemented yet. But anyway, we'd fight about it and she'd get really upset. And I wish I would have just sat with her. I wish I just would have sat with her instead of the like cold, quasi-angry, defensive, I can't believe this is your reaction to this totally normal thing that I'm doing. That, because it started there. Like that was like the seed planting for how I was always going to show up in relationships. Man, there's a ton like in our marriage. I hope these don't make her sound ridiculous, because she's really not ridiculous. She really wasn't. She liked white gold better than yellow gold. I haven't talked about this very many times. It's not in the book. And I'd buy her yellow gold jewelry sometimes. We didn't have a lot of money, so they weren't particularly extravagant things. But most of the things I got her, including her engagement ring, were yellow gold, despite her affinity for white gold. And I just was so dismissive of her preference for white gold on the basis that I thought it looked like silver, and silver is like the inferior, like precious metal to gold. And so I was like, you're going to get like the thing that like is and looks valuable. And I know that might sound so ridiculous, maybe to somebody listening,
it does.
But it's right. It's like, it was another piece of evidence that I will always choose what I think and what I feel over her. It was just another. And so you take like a beautiful gesture, a gift, and you like castrate it somehow. You like cut it off at the knees, whatever. You make it a negative event. And then that same guy, and I'm really talking about me, gets defensive at the quasi like negative reaction to it. The lukewarm reaction you're sort of offended by, because it's like, goodness, how ungrateful can this human be? And then you almost get like mad about it. I mean, stuff like that happened with us. I would fail to consider and fail to validate and then be angry with her for feeling hurt, for feeling dismissed and unheard. And so, I mean, just all these tiny, tiny moments, the vast majority of which I can't remember. And so, right, we talk about forks in the road, but they were they were like, the two lines were just like going by a half degree, each time. But over 12 years, you end up out here. And I didn't know how to think about it like that. I kept waiting for her to like evolve into somebody that would think and feel about stuff the way that I did, which is really ignorant. But I guess I kind of thought something like that was going to happen.
Very common.
So yeah, it's really that. The big one that I feel morally obligated to say is that sometime within a week or two prior to my son being born, our son being born, a couple of dads had told me, listen, she's going to be so exhausted. If her labor is anything like my wife's was, she's going to be so exhausted. It's critical, it's imperative that you get adequate sleep so that when you have to make all these decisions about tons of stuff, shots and circumcisions and birth certificate spellings and all the things, you need to be as with it and lucid as possible. So I had it in my head that I was going to go home. We live really close to the hospital. We was 8 minutes away. I was going to go home and like get like a decent night's sleep after the baby was born. Well, what actually happened was there was an induced labor. It lasted more than 24 hours. And then she had to have an emergency C-section. And she was a wreck, understandably a wreck. And sometime around 1:30 in the morning, about 5 hours after surgery and the birth of our son, I was like, hey, I'm going to go. And then boom, all of a sudden, there's this conflict. Imagine not having the conversation ahead of time, by the way. Like, imagine not having it so that everybody's expectations were met. I have no earthly idea why I was the way that I was. But I was insistent that everything was okay, that she had a nursing staff and they all knew how to do things. And I was worthless. I couldn't help with any of this. I mean, it wasn't about that, right? It was about sitting alone in the dark with somebody. And that, in my estimation, was my greatest abandonment and the biggest trust killer by far. I just really think that's the one that really like did me in and I didn't know it at the time. And I don't think I ever recovered from that. And I think any thoughts she might have had about having a second child with me went out the window really, if not then, very quickly after bringing our baby home and being the default parent from day one. To all the moms out there, I'm so sorry.
No, oh no. But it's so important for people to hear. It really is, because there's like, the little things, like the little snowflakes that kind of pile up into a drift. But like what you were talking about after birth, there's actual a technical term for that sort of thing. And it is an attachment injury. And there are some of these moments that where people are particularly vulnerable after a birth, they're sick, a parent just died, something major is going on, and how we respond to our partners in those moments do carry more weight. And they are either opportunities for connection, and you use the word abandonment, that is how it is experienced in those moments. And they can be their traumas, their injuries. They persist long after the event. And I hear that. That's a hard one.
I may still be something she carries. I wouldn't doubt it. She's very kind to me. She doesn't behave in like a resentful way with me.
Oh, no, yeah. No, I'm understanding. But for the relationship, yeah.
Yes, I would not be surprised if deep down there was still a lot of anger and resentment about that. Despite she lives a very, very, near as I can tell, happy, healthy life. She's been in another relationship for like 6-7 years to an exceedingly decent human being. And everything's great with like our son and I, but that's the one, I think. And then we did lose her father. And I think this is an important idea for people too. We lost her father a few years later, and it was obviously very traumatic. And I think the single greatest like shock, loss, grieving moment of her life. And what's interesting about the loss of her father is I was all in. Like I felt it too. There was not any disagreement about the severity of this incident. I was there, present, locked in, supported. And after the initial sort of wave, the first 2-ish weeks, there was a really hard sort of like shift and pull away that happened. And she was never the same. And it wasn't terribly long after we ended up in separate bedrooms. And then 18 months after that, our marriage officially ended. But when I tried to diagnose my marriage early, as it was falling apart, I believed wholeheartedly that my wife suffered major shock and trauma and grief from the loss of her father, and that she was allowing those intense and understandably intense emotions to like usurp the seriousness, sacredness, importance of our relationship, of our marriage. And so she was allowing an understandably horrible thing to, in an unhealthy way, infect our marriage and not want to participate in it. And that's the reason we fell apart and ended. I truly believed that narrative and felt like a victim of unfair circumstances back then. And what I understand today is that through a series of micro infractions and a couple more major ones, like the hospital incident, I had demonstrated myself to be someone she could simply not trust when life is hard. I treated her the equivalent of the child that I said, there's no monster under the bed, get over yourself.
Yeah.
Everything's fine. So it wasn't about he doesn't love me. It was, he probably does, but his behavior never feels like it. He doesn't feel safe. He doesn't feel like somebody I can count on when life's hard. And so I think that is such a common narrative in relationships where the slow erosion of trust occurs through all these like tiny betrayals and all these tiny invalidations, so to speak. But then when the major event hits, the person in suffering realizes that the other person is not a person that mathematically results in safety and love and care. It's just not. It's not an oasis of peace and togetherness. It sucks. This person is not safe for me, so I'm going to go seek refuge elsewhere or alone because it's better. And I really want people to become aware of the severity of the micro infractions because the collection of those is what yields those relationship ending moments down the road.
Definitely. You hit the nail right on the head. That's always why relationships end, is that when one person stops believing that it could ever be different and what is happening is no longer acceptable. Were you surprised at the very end, or did you think you had more time? Did you think it could still be better?
I slept in the guest room for 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the work started, by the way. I was probably about 3-ish months before she left.
Mm-hmm.
I read a book called How to Improve Your Marriage Without Talking About It. And it was the first book I'd ever read. When I think the title's a misnomer, because I don't think anybody believes you can have a healthy marriage without effective communication. But it was the first time that was less the point than I had for the first time the experience of I'm not alone. If two longtime therapists can write this book and tell these stories about random people, whether they were real or concocted scenarios, I honestly can't remember, but they look, sound, and feel so exactly like my life, which is the beautiful thing. People, I get the feedback I get today that my stories feel like that for other people. And I'm so delighted that that's the experience people are having. I think it's so powerful if you've not had it before to experience the I'm not alone, because I don't think most people talk about the scary, vulnerable, sad stuff that's going on in with our relationships. I think we frequently suffer in silence. But I think men in particular are afraid to tell people. We're afraid to announce it to our parents or our best friends or coworkers. We don't want to look, I don't know if we don't want to look like failures or what, or if we're just not comfortable talking about the hard, scary stuff. But to find out that millions of people have exactly the same dynamics in their relationship was so liberating and empowering, because it was wow, we're not this anomaly. We're not these statistical freaks that we're just a lot of people. And that means the inverse of that is there's a path out. And you said it already, that it was too little too late. The damage was done. So was I surprised? Wasn't surprised intellectually that she left. I was surprised at what my body did when it happened. I was surprised at the loss was really severe for me. The combination of her and then half of my son, he was only 4 at the time, losing. And I know there's a lot of people Matt, you should be grateful you get to see him half the time. Well, probably. But when you're a dad and you love your kid, all you can think is, I only have 14 years left with him. I've just now I have 7. That's how my brain works. I'm I lost 7 years with this little human that I love more than anyone. Anyway, the combo of those two things was brutal. And I don't know, I didn't like it. But it was the fuel necessary to begin this work. I had to learn how to protect my future self and my son from having things like this happen. And I felt this sort of great moral responsibility. And the process gave me so much humility as I slowly uncovered what I believe is the true story of why my marriage ended. And it was a series of miscalculations and blind spots. And I very strongly believe that the vast majority of the pain and disconnection and mistrust in the relationship was a result of things that I did. Not because I'm a terrible person, but because I did not execute effectively what it means to love somebody in a healthy relationship. I didn't know better. And my biggest crime was not doing the work when she was trying to sound the alarm that something was wrong. I just continued to dismiss and invalidate, just like all the other things.
Did you guys ever think about going to couples counseling at some point along the line?
We did a couple of times, but it's, I don't really know. I don't think maybe what a particularly skilled therapist looks like. I think that a lot of couples, forgive me, please, if this implies that
Oh, please speak freely.
People use marriage counseling wrong, in my opinion. They wait till things are horrible and then they go to a third party. And it's why I refuse to work with 2 people at the same time in the same conversation, because I remember what it felt like to have both of us speak and to have you're never even having the same conversation. I'm arguing about whether the dish should matter and she's arguing about being seen and heard. So when you're not having the same conversation, everybody hurts and everybody's getting validated. And I just feel you drive home and you're more pissed. I remember just how wound up and awful it felt. And it was not the fault of the marriage counselor, the therapist. It was the fault of me allowing this to have built up to where it did. what I really wish people would do, I wish people would go to marriage counseling all the time as maintenance.
Did you know that most marriage counselors, I shouldn't even call that, most therapists who offer marriage counseling have no specialized training or experience in couples therapy? Like 98% of therapists who are doing couples counseling do not have the training and experience to help. Like what happened to you two sounds like had the same old fight just in their office instead of in your living room. Like, why did we go pay for that?
Yes, sure.
A truly expert marriage and family therapist who knows what to do in those moments would have handled it very differently. And so I am hearing just another layer of tragedy. Not that, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't have been different in that moment, but that is really just crappy. And I'm mad for you that you had that experience.
Thank you. I don't want to...
Yeah.
I'm certainly not disparaging the profession. And I think it really matters.
I feel annoyed about the profession for that reason.
Thank you. But
people are practicing outside their scope of competence, and it has very real consequences for families.
Right. It's why. I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here, but I want to work with one human on personal responsibility and habits to show up differently for the other person. That is like my charge, if you will, and nothing else, because I don't know how to navigate so many of those complexities that occur between two people. And there's traumas. There's like legitimate traumas that people need to work through as individuals, not just the relationship traumas, but the individual traumas from childhood and things like that. And that's I don't even know how to identify or name those things. But in the spirit of consideration, in the spirit of I need to mindfully calculate for my relationship partner so that I do things that serve their best interest instead of harm them. If we're unaware of a trauma, of a pain point, again, you're constantly flying blind. So I think those are a lot of pitfalls for a lot of people out there. And I did not have the wherewithal 10, 15 years ago to say any of the things I just said, to think about, the way my wife at the time's dynamics with her parents and her older brother, those family dynamics might have contributed to she was the baby. And thing I know today that I knew back then, but I didn't appreciate was she always felt like she didn't have a voice in the family. Like she was least likely to have any sort of like power in the family, or that like if her brother picked on her, her parents would, and her brother's awesome. So I get it. But her parents didn't save her, didn't rescue her. So she felt like she had this residual sort of disrespect, mistreatment, cast to the side. And this is a concept that I understand how I was perpetually triggering that through a series of things that I was doing. And I used to poke fun at her a little bit, and she'd ask me not to.
But we all have our wounds, that we're carrying into our relationships. And that's the work, is understanding what those are and what our partner's wounds are, so that we can attend to them. And it sounds like, you understand things now that you didn't then. And I know that we probably need to glide to a stop here soon, but I also just want to commend the work that you're doing now. I'm hearing kind of between the lines that when things finally did come apart, it was, as it is for so many people. I mean, when you lose your primary attachment, it's in your family, it's incredibly traumatizing, but that you used this painful experience to really become an activist, to say, okay, what happened, and really are so committed to doing good work and communicating things that you didn't know then, but that you do know now, to other people, so that they can hear and understand and have the opportunity to do something with this sooner than you did. And not that I'm happy for anything that you went through, but I always admire people who are able to do something so positive, not despite of their adversity, but because of it. And you're doing that.
No, thank you. I feel the same way. I agree. I love the guy that gets out of prison and then spends the rest of his life helping troubled youth. I love those kinds of stories. And it's almost similar, sort of metaphorically. Sometimes this regular guy way that I talk about things is useful to another quote unquote regular guy out there.
Absolutely.
If there is such a thing, at least what my brain calculates to be quote unquote regular guy. They don't know either. They don't have the awareness and the relational skills, and they love their spouse and they love their children.
They do.
And can we get to a place? And so the feedback sometimes from guys is thank you, because your life sounds like my life. And now I'm able to like avoid some of the mistakes that you did. And I love hearing that. And then from wives, from girlfriends, I'm frequently hearing relationship partners. Because again, as you know, it doesn't always fall in gender lines. It just sort of statistically commonly does. But to feel heard and seen and validated, and it gives me hope that, the men in my life might be able to come to some of these realizations. It's just really cool that I get to be like a part of that, considering that the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and in my estimation, the worst things that I've ever done, are rooted in the exact opposite of all of that. I am frankly proud of it. I don't want to sound like back patty, like I think I'm really great. I don't, but I am very proud of what you said. We're trying to like leverage pain into like something positive, because that's very real, and it's a passion project. I don't know if you know that my parents split when I was 4. And then,
so did mine.
I split when my son was 4. And it's just been this like life-defining thing. Divorce has been like in the background my entire life, making everything a little bit more painful, a little bit more inconvenient. And then to learn that, in highly oversimplified terms, so much of it is blind spots and misunderstandings, a lack of awareness, a lack of skills that nobody's ever like taught anybody. To come to believe that, it feels like such a crisis, tragedy. It's like, can I be part of just, I don't know. I think of myself as somebody who raises awareness, right? Like, I just want to raise awareness that things you're not paying attention to are probably the things that could cause you the most harm. So please pay attention. And I'm delighted to be invited to these conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing this message. And I completely agree. It's raising awareness, paying attention to things that you might not think to pay attention to are actually the important ones. Thank you so much for spending this time today, and you guys listening. So Matthew Frey, his book is "This Is How Your Marriage Ends: A Hopeful Approach to Saving Relationships," and you have many more stories and personal insights, and also a fair number of strategies and tips throughout that book. So thank you so much for consolidating your wisdom into a manual.
Thank you so much for reading it. It's embarrassing almost when someone like you does it. I just think about all the times you're like, I don't know about that, but It's so nice. It feels really good to have someone like you sort of like sign off on it as being like a legitimate piece of work in the world. Like I value that really highly. Thank you.
Thank you. And you're 100% spot on. It's right on the money. It's that attachment and connection and emotional attunement and how you create it or not. So anyway, I'm so glad that we got to chat today, Matthew. Thank you again for taking the time to do this with me. And let me know if you'd ever like to come back. You have other books coming out in the future. We'll talk again sometime.
Thank you. Anytime you'd like to, I will be here.
From tomorrow, I don't wanna sail